identifying risk factors for broiler chickens dead on arrivals. So, why would we focus on the last few hours of a broiler chicken's life? They undergo many stressors after a relatively monotonous life, and all the producer's investments have been made at this point, such as the cost of the chick and the cost of feed and maintaining the barns. So now they are at the risk for the largest loss. In a European study, it was found that 84% of Europeans believe that the welfare of farmed animals should be better protected in their country. A similar number reported that they support limiting the transport time of these farmed animals. So, what all does a broiler chicken undergo at this phase? This is called the pre-slaughter phase / live haul. Broadly, these activities can be categorized into these three groups. So catching and loading, transportation, and lairage. I will discuss these in a bit more detail first, followed by the associated risk factors for dead on arrivals. I didn't mention this before, but for every flock that is transported to the slaughterhouse, feed and water are removed for food safety reasons. Feed is typically withdrawn 8 to 12 hours before slaughter, while water access is removed right before catching. Next is catching and loading. The catching process most often occurs in dim light to minimize bird activity and distress. This can be done manually, as seen here, or mechanically. When these birds are manually caught, they are typically picked up by both of their legs, carried upside down, and then loaded into containers with plastic crates or drawer systems. Catchers can carry up to 5 birds in each hand. These birds can also be mechanically caught, as shown here, where a vehicle with a conveyor belt or rotating rubber fingers is driven through the barn to catch and load the birds into crates. An alternative to manual or mechanical catching that was just shown is the upright catching method. These birds can be carried upright by their abdomen. Although this is rarely applied, it is a requirement for Global Animal Partnership, also known as GAP certification. Next is transportation, and this is where the broilers are transported from the farm to plant. These broilers should be upright and crated in a single layer, allowing them space to sit comfortably, and the appropriate crate stocking density depends on the bird size and climatic conditions. These transport trucks may have tarps, curtains, or ventilation doors to protect birds from extreme weather, but in some cases, no such protections are in place. The transport duration and distance also varies depending on how far the farm is from the slaughterhouse. Transport durations have ranged anywhere from 2 up to 12 hours, but it may also vary on the country, with European countries typically having longer transport times and the US having shorter transport times. Next is lairage. This is the location at the plant where the trucks wait prior to processing. This can be a warehouse, an open building with a roof, or just an area where the trucks are parked. This allows the birds to recover from transportation stressors and also allows the slaughterhouse to have a buffer of birds so that the slaughter line is never unintentionally empty. This usually ranges anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, but it may vary depending on the logistics of the slaughterhouse and also the country. Most plants do have active ventilation, such as fans, misters with fans, or heaters to help the birds with the climatic conditions. So you may wonder how this all impacts the birds. Catching and loading can lead to mortality. It was found that 89% of dead on arrival birds were due to trauma inflicted during the catching, loading, and unloading process. In addition, fractures, bruises, and dislocations can happen due to the method, the way that they are caught. This can also elicit acute stress, such as increasing corticosteroid concentrations in birds that were handled inverted versus birds that were handled upright. And then it can also elicit fear, such as increased fear responses when they are handled rough, compared to when they are handled gentler. Transport, this can lead to mortality depending on the stocking density, weather conditions, the season that they are transported, distance or duration, and the moment of transport. This can also elicit acute stress and fear through increased corticosteroid concentrations, but also increase heterophil to lymphocyte ratios. In addition, a prolonged lairage duration can lead to increased mortality. Today, I will only focus on mortality, often referred to dead on arrivals, but all of these are an animal welfare concern. This is also an economic loss, as broilers that are found dead on arrival cannot be used for human consumption, and then also fractures, dislocations, and bruises lead to parts being trimmed and lower in value. For mortality, it was estimated that the global loss was $117 to $450 million annually. So, how common is this issue? Here on the graph on the x-axis, I have commercial studies during various years and in various countries. And then on the y-axis, the mean dead on arrival prevalence in percentage. This ranged anywhere from 0.06 to 0.9%. These may look relatively low since most are under 1%. However, this can have a huge impact when taken into the number of broilers produced in the United States. In 2024, around 9.3 billion birds were produced in the United States. If we take these numbers into account, that means that between 5.8 and 79 million birds die annually on their way to slaughter. So, what are some risks that have been identified in research? First is genetic strain. Fast-growing broilers, which are mostly used in commercial production, were more at risk than slow-growing broilers because they are not as robust, not able to handle heat stress as well, and have an increased risk for health issues. Increasing on-farm mortality is also a risk factor. On-farm mortality can reflect flock health, and if there is a poor flock health, this can lead to increase the risk of mortality later in life. In addition, bird sex, increased age, and increased body weight can increase the risk of mortality. Males typically have higher body weights compared to females, and they are more susceptible to thermal stress and sudden death syndrome. As broilers age and gain weight, their ability to thermoregulate decreases, making them more susceptible to heat stress. In addition, their relatively small heart and lung sizes causes difficulty maintaining circulation, and under stress, this can lead to heart failure and fluid accumulation in the lungs and abdomen, causing respiratory distress and death. Catching and loading can also increase the injury risk, which then increase the mortality risk. So with the catching method, we discussed earlier mechanical versus manual. During mechanical catching, these broilers that are dead may not be removed by the catching team, whereas they normally are when manual catching is used. These dead birds may be loaded and later recorded as dead on arrival, artificially increasing that prevalence, even if the catching process itself did not increase mortality. However, both methods can also lead to injuries. There has been conflicting literature about which one causes more injuries. However, when using manual catching, workers can become fatigued, and this can lead to an increased risk of injuries and thus death. In addition, heat stress is a big risk for dead on arrivals, which is more likely during those midday transports. This can lead to elevated body temperatures and ineffective panting that lead to physiological disturbances that can result in death. In addition, birds are more active under bright light, which is also during the daytime, compared to dim lighting. And when they are more active, the catching crew will have more difficulty collecting the birds, increasing the risk of injuries and thus dead on arrivals. This, all in part, can be linked to handling trauma, which then increases dead on arrival prevalence. It was found that 60% of dead on arrivals were linked to handling trauma, which means that these birds suffered pain before their death. Prolonged transport and lairage also increase the risk of mortality. So low crate stocking density during extreme cold temperatures poses a risk from hypothermia, that is death due to being too cold. On the other hand, high stocking density can be detrimental at high temperatures, predisposing the birds to death from hyperthermia. A high stocking density can also lead to birds piling on top of each other and suffocating. Longer and further journeys and longer lairage durations also prolong birds' exposure to stressors such as feed and water withdrawal, adverse environmental conditions, which vary with season, vibration and vehicle motion, and crowding. Extended exposure to these stressors increases the likelihood of birds dying during the pre-slaughter phase. So, what can we do to prevent mortality after we just discussed all the risk factors that were associated with mortality? We can prepare the flock for a stressful day. So, strict selection. Which birds will likely not make it through the day? You can figure out which birds you believe are unfit for transport, and if they are unfit, they should be culled prior to catching and loading. Or even if they look sick throughout the rearing period, you can cull then. For feed withdrawal, making sure that this duration is not too long, as it can lead to distress, hunger, and dehydration, but also not too short as to not risk food safety. If possible, you can slaughter the broilers younger. As we saw, younger and lighter broilers were at less risk for dead on arrivals compared to those heavier and older broilers. I do understand that this may not be under everyone's control, especially in commercial practices, but if possible, this is something that can be taken into consideration. They should also be handled with care. As previously discussed, catching and loading are major risks for trauma-induced deaths. You can consider using mechanical versus manual catching. And then also training the catching crew to know the importance of animal welfare and what the best practices are to reduce those prevalence of injuries and dead on arrivals. We can also manage the conditions to fit the bird's needs. So catching in the dark during early morning or nighttime to reduce bird activity. Reduced bird activity will make it easier to catch the birds regardless of the catching method. Adjusting crate stocking density according to temperature. So if temperatures are very low, maybe stocking the birds a little bit higher so that they can use each other for warmth and thermoregulation. But then if it's too hot, maybe lowering the stocking density so that they are able to have space to loosen their feathers. We can also schedule transportation during cooler parts of the day in the warm season, and then vice versa, scheduling during warmer parts in the cold season so that these birds can try to stay within their thermoneutral zone. In addition, lairage times could be shortened, and lairage conditions can also be improved to help these birds stay within their thermal neutral zone. So in conclusion, mortality represents the ultimate risk to broiler chicken health. This can be improved by preparing flocks for a stressful day, handling the birds with care, and managing pre-slaughter conditions to fit the bird's needs. Thank you, and I am open to any questions.
Great work, Sam. There are a few questions for you. One question that came from the audience was, do you think that auditing for certification, maybe specifically for this sort of pre-slaughter phase, or maybe just general, would reduce the dead on arrival rates?
That's a great question. So when you are audited with welfare certifications, there is a certain threshold that you cannot pass. So if this threshold is passed, this means that corrective action must take place. So in conclusion, yes, it would, because you would have to go in, investigate why that DOA prevalence is high, for example, and then take action and show the auditor later on that the DOA prevalence reduced with your actions.
Thank you. Another question was, could you explain the association between the feed withdrawal time not being too long, not being too short, and food safety concerns?
Yes, so I don't have too much information about that, but with food safety concerns, there has to be a minimal feed withdrawal time as to empty the gut so that when it is later processed, this does not lead to any leakage, which then the meat will not be contaminated and not be able to use for human consumption. On the other hand, we see that an increased feed withdrawal can lead to distress, hunger, and dehydration. So trying to find a balance in between where we're not risking food safety, but we're also not risking those animal welfare issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. So would you be able to put a time on the sort of ideal feed withdrawal time? I know it's a hard question.
Not personally. I would have to look back into the literature, and it also varies between countries as well.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Let's see. Was there one of the risk factors that if you'd have a chance to like change one thing, was there one of the risk factors or solutions that you would focus on or emphasize as being especially impactful to reduce dead on arrival rates?
I would say the catching method, as we saw, both can lead to increase of injuries and DOAs, but I think it should be further studied to see exactly which one is causing these injuries and DOAs and which one should we use in the industry or even in backyard practices to lower the risk of those welfare issues.